Before the Marines ever saw the M2 flamethrower, before they understood how a weapon so terrifying could become the difference between living and dying, they first learned what it meant to attack a Japanese bunker without it. The Pacific in 1942 and early 1943 was not a battlefield built for human beings. It was a world of choking humidity, tangled vines, knee-deep mud, and an enemy that knew how to turn every inch of ground into a death trap. On islands like Guadalcanal, New Georgia, Bougainville, and later Tarawa, Japanese engineers carved tunnels into hillsides, buried bunkers beneath layers of coconut logs and sand, and built firing slits barely wide enough for the muzzle flash of a machine gun. These positions were nearly invisible until they erupted in fire, and by then, Marines were already falling in the open. Marines who fought in those early months understood that the jungle was only half the enemy. The other half was the architecture of Japanese defense. A single bunker could hold up an entire battalion. The Japanese Type 92 machine gun, known for its slow, rhythmic beat, could pin down a whole company with a few bursts. Snipers hid in trees. Riflemen waited behind trap doors carved into the jungle floor. Mortar crews fired from tunnels that twisted dozens of yards underground. Every position seemed to be connected to another. You could silence one bunker only to have two more open fire from different angles. In these conditions, without a flamethrower, the only way to take a bunker was to crawl toward it under fire. Marines had to work in teams. One would sprint forward a few feet while another covered him. Then the next man would move. Inch by inch, they crept through mud and brush, knowing that one mistake, one rise of the head above a log, could end everything. When they reached the bunker, they would toss grenades or try to jam a block of TNT into the firing slit. Sometimes it worked. Often the Japanese would throw the explosives back. Other times the Marines simply could not get close enough. Too many men were cut down before they reached the opening. Reports from the Solomon Islands showed casualties that shocked officers back in Washington. Entire platoons were wiped out trying to silence a single strong point. At times, Marines charged a bunker again and again because there was simply no other option. This was where the phrase "one-way charge" became part of their vocabulary. It described an attack that had almost no chance of survival but had to be attempted anyway. The bunkers were built to force exactly that choice. On Guadalcanal, Marines learned the cruelty of this reality early. While fighting around the Matanikau River in late 1942, they faced networks of bunkers dug into hillsides. Some were so well camouflaged that men did not notice them until the earth in front of them spat fire. Marines who crawled forward with satchel charges were often killed before they could pull the fuse. Others managed to get close but lacked the angle to deliver the explosive where it needed to go. Time and again, squads were pinned down by one or two machine guns hidden in wooden and earthen armor. Commanders, watching their men disappear into the green maze, knew something was wrong. They were fighting an enemy that the standard infantry weapons of the time could not root out. New Georgia only made the lesson harsher. The Japanese defense relied on interlocking fields of fire, carefully prepared kill zones, and bunkers carved into limestone ridges. The jungle floor felt like a trap designed to funnel attackers directly into hidden weapons. Marines attacked through narrow paths because the vegetation was too thick to maneuver elsewhere. They crawled across muddy ravines. They climbed ridges lined with pointed stakes. The Japanese had dozens of positions that simply could not be reached without losing more men than the terrain was worth. Infantry commanders began writing in their reports that they needed a weapon capable of flushing the enemy from enclosed positions without sacrificing entire rifle squads. Tarawa, in late 1943, provided the most brutal proof of all. The atoll was small, flat, and nearly barren of jungle, yet its Japanese defenses were some of the most lethal the Marines had ever seen. Concrete bunkers covered the beaches. Coconut log pillboxes lined the interior. Rifle pits connected by tunnels waited behind the seawall. When the Marines landed, the machine guns opened up almost immediately. Men were cut down waist-deep in water before they reached the shore. Those who crawled to the seawall found themselves pinned from multiple sides. Some Marines crawled forward with TNT charges strapped to their chests, trying to get close enough to place them at the base of the bunker. Many did not return. One Marine later said that the only reason anyone survived at all was because they found bodies to hide behind. It was on Tarawa where commanders realized that continuing to assault bunkers without specialized weapons was unsustainable. They needed something that could reach inside enclosed defensive positions, something that could force a hidden enemy to abandon their fortifications or face the consequences. Rifles were useless. Grenades often bounced off logs. Satchel charges required suicidal bravery. The enemy refused to surrender. They fought until the last man, the last corner of the last bunker. This was not a war where the enemy broke and ran. This was a war where the only way to clear a fortification was to remove the will of the men inside to keep fighting. The Marines did not want to lose men in endless charges. They did not want to sacrifice entire squads. They wanted a way to bring the fight to the defenders without losing half their number in the attempt. Before the arrival of the M2 Flamethrower, Marines often found themselves staring at bunker openings, knowing exactly what they had to do and knowing exactly what the cost would be. They could hear Japanese voices echoing from inside, could see dark slits in coconut log walls, could feel the air vibrate with the thump of machine gun fire. They knew that the next few seconds might define whether they lived or became another body on the field. And they charged anyway because there was no alternative. By early 1943, the United States Marine Corps faced a truth that no commander wanted to acknowledge. The rifles, grenades, and satchel charges carried by infantrymen were not enough to break the Japanese defensive systems that dominated the jungle islands of the Pacific. The enemy had mastered the art of disappearing into earth and timber. They built fortifications that refused to fall, even under artillery bombardment. If the Marines were to survive the coming campaigns in the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, and eventually the Volcano Islands, they needed a weapon capable of reaching inside spaces where standard infantry tools could not go. They needed a weapon that could force a decision upon the defenders without exposing American troops to the slaughter of close-quarters assaults. And in 1943, that weapon arrived. The M2 Flamethrower was not elegant. It was not beloved. It was not even considered a proper infantry gun. It was a device of tanks, hoses, fuel, and raw fire. An invention that looked like it belonged more to industrial labor than to the battlefield. Yet the first time the Marines saw it demonstrated, they understood instantly that the M2 was exactly the thing they had been missing. It was a tool that could make the difference between taking a bunker and losing a platoon. It was a weapon designed not for beauty or prestige, but for the brutal realities of Pacific Island warfare. The M2 consisted of two cylindrical fuel tanks strapped to a steel frame worn like a backpack. These tanks held a thickened fuel mixture that would later evolve into even more viscous formulas, resembling early napalm. Between the tanks sat a pressure cylinder that propelled the burning mixture through a rubber hose to the nozzle. The nozzle, held by both hands, contained an ignition system capable of lighting the fuel as it left the barrel. With a pull of the trigger, a jet of flame shot forward in a loud, violent burst. The range varied depending on the mixture, but trained operators could hit targets 20 to 30 yards away. The flame clung to surfaces, it bent around corners, it crawled into openings too small for grenades, and it generated temperatures so intense that even fortified Japanese positions could not withstand it. The weapon was terrifying for the men who carried it. An operator strapped nearly 70 pounds to his back. 40 pounds were fuel. The rest were the tanks, the frame, and the ignition system. The men chosen to carry the M2 were not volunteers most of the time. They were assigned based on build, steadiness of hand, and the ability to remain calm in the worst possible circumstances. Everyone who saw the flame operators knew their job was the most dangerous in the platoon. If a flamethrower man fell, the weapon on his back became a target that the enemy desperately wanted to hit. Japanese soldiers were trained to prioritize flamethrower operators. They knew the danger this weapon posed. They aimed for the tanks first. Despite this, the Marines who operated the M2 understood its importance. They knew that their weapon could save lives on a scale that rifles and machine guns simply could not match. For the first time, infantrymen had a tool that could sweep defenders out of underground tunnels without requiring a direct assault. The flamethrower produced two effects. The first was physical. The intense heat and expanding gases created pressure inside enclosed spaces that made it impossible for defenders to remain. The second was psychological. A burst of flame roaring into a bunker broke the resolve of even the most determined fighters. Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender under any circumstances would leave their positions when fire forced them out. In doing so, they exposed themselves to Marines waiting outside. The M2 did not merely kill, it compelled movement. It transformed static defenses into vulnerable ones. When the first batches of M2 units arrived in the Pacific, Marines trained on them with a mixture of awe and unease. The nozzle required control. The tanks had to be secured. The ignition system had to be checked meticulously. Everything about the weapon felt volatile, as if one wrong motion could turn the operator into a torch. But the men learned its rhythms. They practiced aiming. They learned how to adjust the pressure and burst duration. They memorized the sound it made when the fuel mixture burned properly. They watched as sheets of flame rolled across sand targets and wooden mock bunkers, and for the first time since Guadalcanal, they felt a sense of possibility. One Marine wrote in a letter home that the M2 looked like a demon's backpack, but felt like a gift sent straight from heaven. Another described watching a training demonstration and realizing that this was the one tool that could keep his squad alive in the thick jungles ahead. Marines had never feared enemy fortifications more than they did in 1942. They had never felt more vulnerable. The arrival of the M2 changed that. It gave them a weapon that flipped the equation. But the M2 was not simply a response to battlefield needs. It was the product of American engineering trying to solve a tactical nightmare. The Army and Marine Corps had tested earlier flamethrower designs, including models that were unreliable or too short-ranged. Engineers pushed for greater pressure capacity, more consistent ignition, and a composition of fuel that would burn longer and stick to surfaces. By 1943, after dozens of refinements, the M2 was finally ready. It became the standard flamethrower used across the Pacific. Once in the field, its importance became evident almost immediately. Commanders began integrating flamethrower teams into assault formations. Riflemen protected the flame operators as they advanced. Machine gunners laid down suppressive fire. Engineers used explosives to breach outer barricades, allowing the flamethrower man to reach the firing slit or bunker entrance. Each action revolved around the moment when the flame operator stepped forward. The Pacific War was about to enter its most brutal phase, with islands like Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa waiting ahead. In those battles, the M2 would prove not only its lethality, but its ability to save thousands of Marines from suicidal assaults. But in 1943, as flame operators strapped on the heavy tanks for the first time, they had no idea how critical their role would soon become. Part 2 ends with the rising awareness among Marines that the M2 was not a weapon of cruelty, but a weapon of survival. They would need courage to use it. They would risk their lives every time they stepped forward. But with this tool on their backs, they no longer had to face the impossible odds of bunker assaults armed only with rifles and grenades. For the first time, they held a weapon that could turn the battlefield in their favor. The war ahead would test them in ways they could not yet imagine, but the M2 had given them something priceless: a chance to live. The Marines who carried the M2 flamethrower into battle lived with a truth few others understood. Every step they took placed them at the center of two competing forces. Behind them were the men whose lives depended on their success. In front of them were Japanese fortifications so deadly that no rifle squad could break them without terrible loss. Between those forces, carrying nearly 70 pounds of fuel and steel, walked the flamethrower operator. He was the man everyone looked toward when a bunker refused to fall. He was also the man most likely to die before the mission was done. Flamethrower operators did not move the way riflemen did. A rifleman could crouch and weave. A machine gunner could drop flat and vanish into cover. But a flame operator carried a metal frame that rose high above his shoulders. The tanks clanged, the hose dangled. The weight pulled against his balance with every stride. In the jungle, the equipment snagged vines and branches. On volcanic islands, the tanks scraped against rocks. Every sound felt like a beacon. Every movement felt like exposure. The men who carried the M2 were painfully aware of this. They called themselves walking targets. Despite this, they kept going, because the alternative was watching their friends die trying to do a job that only fire could accomplish. Many flamethrower operators were assigned, not volunteers, but over time something changed. They became proud of their role, not because the weapon inspired admiration, but because it created possibility where none had existed. They were the ones who could give Marines a chance to advance without losing half a platoon. They were the ones who could turn an impregnable stronghold into a manageable objective. They carried fire because someone had to, and because they knew that without them, more Marines would fall. In training, flamethrower men learned how to move with their burdens. They practiced sliding into cover with the tanks pressed close to their backs. They trained on how to crawl without exposing the pressure cylinder. They memorized the hiss of proper ignition and the sputter that signaled a fuel blockage. But nothing prepared them for what awaited on the battlefield. The first time a flame operator walked toward a Japanese fortification, he felt the weight as something more than metal. It felt like destiny or doom. On Saipan, a young flamethrower operator named James made his way toward a coconut log bunker that had stopped two entire squads. Machine gun fire raked the ground. Snipers fired from the trees. Engineers had tried twice to get explosives close enough to the firing slit. Both attempts failed. Now James moved forward, bent low, the nozzle steady in his hands. He could feel the tanks vibrating with each heartbeat. Every burst of enemy fire made him flinch. But he kept moving, inch by inch, until he was close enough to feel the heat radiating from the bunker's firing slit. Then he pulled the trigger. The roar of the M2 drowned out the battle. A jet of flame shot forward, arcing into the opening. Within seconds, the bunker fell silent. His squad advanced. James collapsed in the sand, exhausted but alive. The men behind him told him later that his attack had saved 12 lives. He never forgot that. On Tinian, flamethrower operators fought across fields of cane flowers taller than their heads. They could not see the bunkers until they were almost touching them. Japanese soldiers waited silently inside, holding their fire until the flame operator was close enough to kill with a single burst. One operator wrote afterward that every mission felt like walking into a mouth waiting to swallow him. Yet he went anyway. His squad depended on him. They needed his fire to push forward. The operators also learned that the M2 imposed a psychological burden as heavy as its physical weight. When they fired into a bunker, the sound and heat were overwhelming. The jet of flame hissed and roared. The ground trembled. The fuel ignited everything it touched. Even the Marines standing behind them felt the force of the blast. Some flamethrower operators spoke quietly after the war about the things they saw when the fire cleared. They carried those memories for the rest of their lives. But they also remembered the men who survived because of their actions. That balance between horror and salvation defined their role. Japanese soldiers knew the danger a flamethrower posed to their fortifications. They targeted flamethrower operators first. Some snipers waited specifically for the man carrying the tanks. Others launched sudden charges to kill the operator before he could fire. The operators understood this. They moved differently because of it. Riflemen often formed protective screens around them. Machine gunners laid suppressive fire ahead of them. Engineers cleared paths. The flame operator became the center of the assault formation. On volcanic islands like Iwo Jima, the danger increased tenfold. The Japanese garrison lived in a fortress of underground tunnels, caves, and pillboxes. Marines could hear the enemy talking beneath their feet. Rifle fire alone could not reach them. Grenades disappeared into openings, only to be tossed back out. Satchel charges sometimes succeeded, but required suicidal exposure. The flamethrower operators became the only effective tool for clearing these positions. They crawled across black sand under the weight of their tanks. They felt the heat of their own fuel sloshing behind them. And still they pushed on, knowing that if they reached the open end of a cave or tunnel, the M2 would give the men behind them a fighting chance. One Marine who survived Iwo Jima later said that flamethrower operators were the bravest men he ever saw. It was not that they were fearless. It was that they acted despite their fear. Their job demanded that they stand in the open while every enemy weapon on the battlefield pointed at them. And they did it because lives depended on them. Part 3 ends with the image of a flamethrower operator at dusk, sitting on the ground with the tank still strapped to his back, sweat and dust streaking his face, hands trembling from adrenaline. Around him, the men of his squad gather, alive because he walked forward when they could not. He is exhausted, he is shaken, but he is still breathing. And tomorrow, he knows he will have to do it again. By the end of 1943, the M2 flamethrower had become more than a new piece of equipment. It had become a turning point. The Pacific Campaign was entering its most brutal and decisive phase, and with every new island, the Japanese defenses grew stronger, deeper, and more complex. Concrete bunkers replaced wooden ones. Tunnel networks stretched for hundreds of yards. Firing ports were narrowed to the width of a fist. Fields of fire overlapped so precisely that a single Marine lifting his head might be hit from 3 angles at once. In this environment, the M2 was not simply helpful, it was essential. Without it, the casualty lists would have swallowed entire battalions. Tarawa was the first great demonstration of this truth. The landing beaches were raked with fire from reinforced concrete blockhouses. Machine guns, mortars, and rifles poured bullets into every approach. Earlier assaults had shown how impossible it was to reach these positions without catastrophic losses. But once the flamethrowers were brought forward, everything changed. A single burst of flame poured into a bunker forced Japanese defenders to abandon their posts. Marines who had been trapped for hours behind the seawall suddenly found openings to advance. The M2 did not win Tarawa alone, but without it the price would have been far greater. Marines began to understand that the weapon they feared was also the one keeping them alive. The lesson carried directly into the battles of the Marianas. On Saipan, bunkers were carved into volcanic rock and reinforced with timber, coral, and concrete. Some were connected by tunnels so deep that grenades and satchel charges barely scratched them. Rifle squads spent entire mornings pinned down by a single position that refused to break. Only when a flamethrower operator managed to reach the opening did the tide shift. Once the flame entered the dark interior, defenders who had resisted grenades and machine gun bursts were forced into the open. Riflemen waiting outside cut them down. In these moments, Marines saw the true value of the M2. It did not have to destroy a bunker to neutralize it. It only needed to make the defenders move. Tinian showed the same pattern. The island was smaller but more heavily fortified than Saipan. Bunkers were carved into volcanic rock and reinforced with timber, coral, and concrete. Some were connected by tunnels so deep that grenades and satchel charges barely scratched them. Rifle squads spent entire mornings pinned down by a single position that refused to break. Only when a flamethrower operator managed to reach the opening did the tide shift. Once the flame entered the dark interior, defenders who had resisted grenades and machine gun bursts were forced into the open. Riflemen waiting outside cut them down. In these moments, Marines saw the true value of the M2. It did not have to destroy a bunker to neutralize it. It only needed to make the defenders move. But nowhere did the M2 prove more essential than on Iwo Jima. The island was a fortress built from volcanic ash and black lava rock. Japanese defenders lived in a labyrinth of tunnels with firing ports that covered nearly every inch of the terrain. Rifle fire was almost useless. Mortars could not reach the deepest chambers. Grenades bounced off narrow openings. Even satchel charges often failed to deliver decisive results. Only flame could reach into the twisting interior of the caves. Flamethrower operators on Iwo Jima became some of the most important men on the battlefield. They crawled across sand that burned their hands. They closed distances that no one else could cross. They directed jets of flame into pillboxes that had resisted hour after hour of direct assault. Marines recorded the transformation in their after-action reports. They wrote that without flamethrowers, the advance would have stalled on the beaches. They wrote that entire companies would have been wiped out trying to clear caves manually. They wrote that the M2 made possible what no other weapon in their arsenal could achieve. One officer stated bluntly that flamethrowers were worth more to the assault than tanks on many parts of the island. The reason was simple. Tanks could not climb the steep rock inclines. Tanks could not maneuver through the narrow defiles. Tanks often became trapped in soft sand. But flamethrower operators could go anywhere a man could crawl. Okinawa pushed this even further. The Japanese positions were not just fortified, they were layered in depth across miles of ridges and escarpments. The Shuri Line was perhaps the single strongest defensive position encountered in the entire Pacific War. The Japanese fired from caves so deep that sound itself seemed to vanish inside them. The M2 became crucial in demolishing these underground strongholds. Marines noted that flame often traveled around corners, into cracks, and down shafts that light could not even penetrate. It reached defenders who believed themselves untouchable. And with every use came the same recognition. If the flamethrower had not been available, men would have been ordered to assault those positions directly. Hundreds would have died clearing each ridge. Thousands would have fallen clearing the entire island. The M2 was not simply a tool of destruction, it was a tool of preservation. It gave Marines a way to fight that did not involve throwing their bodies into machine gun fire or crawling up the throat of a cave with a block of TNT strapped to their chest. Commanders saw this clearly. They began integrating flame units into every major offensive plan. They paired flamethrowers with demolition teams. They redesigned infantry tactics to revolve around flame-based assault sequences. They created combined arms teams specifically built to attack bunkers, caves, and pillboxes. Each sequence followed a predictable rhythm. Suppressive fire pinned the defenders. Engineers blew outer barriers. The flame operator advanced. The defenders fled, were captured, or were cut down. Then riflemen and machine gunners moved forward to secure the ground. What began as an emergency solution quickly became standard doctrine. A war that had once consumed men in endless, bloody charges was now shaped by controlled bursts of flame that saved lives by preventing the need for heroic but fatal assaults. Marines across the Pacific began speaking about the M2 not with affection but with respect. They acknowledged that it was dangerous for the operator. They acknowledged that it produced scenes no man easily forgot. But they also understood that without it, far fewer Marines would have survived the war. Part 4 ends with the image of a bunker complex falling silent under the roar of the M2. Not because the defenders had been annihilated, but because they could no longer stay where they were. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Marines possessed a weapon that could force movement, break stalemates, and tear apart the strongest Japanese defenses without spilling the blood of entire platoons. In a world where every yard of ground had once cost lives, the M2 replaced sacrifice with strategy. It made survival possible, and soon, as the Marines would learn in the final phase of the war, it would become the most paradoxical weapon of all, one built from terror, but remembered for the lives it saved. When the war finally ended, and the surviving Marines sailed home across the Pacific, many carried memories so heavy that no medal or ceremony could lighten them. Among those memories were the moments when the M2 flamethrower roared to life, turning darkness inside a bunker into blinding light, forcing an enemy that refused to surrender into movement, and giving American infantry a chance to live through battles that once seemed unwinnable. Yet long after the gunfire faded, a strange truth began to settle over the men who had fought with and alongside the M2. They realized that the weapon they feared most, the weapon that horrified even those who used it, had saved more American lives in the Pacific than any rifle, grenade, or machine gun. After the war, Marine flamethrower operators spoke quietly about the role they played. Many struggled with the memories. They had walked toward positions others backed away from. They had faced snipers who hunted them first. They had watched their nozzles pour fire into enclosed spaces, knowing exactly what it meant. But they also spoke about something else, something that few outside the battlefield understood. They spoke about the Marines who survived because the flamethrower existed. They spoke about the squads that would have been wiped out assaulting a bunker. They spoke about the men who avoided charging into narrow cave openings because the M2 forced the defenders to flee instead. For these operators, the moral weight of the weapon was heavy, but so was the understanding that without it, far more Americans would have died. In the years immediately following the war, the Marine Corps compiled detailed evaluations of every weapon used in the Pacific. Commanders concluded that the flamethrower had been one of the most decisive infantry tools in the entire theater. They wrote that it was indispensable for clearing fortified positions. They wrote that its psychological impact on defenders shortened battles that might otherwise have lasted days. They wrote that it saved countless American lives by eliminating the need for direct assaults into well-prepared fortifications. One general stated plainly that the flamethrower, despite its fearsome appearance and controversial use, had saved more Marines than any other specialized infantry weapon during the island campaigns. Japanese officers confirmed this in their own post-war reports. They admitted that flame was the one weapon their soldiers feared more than any other. They said that caves, which could survive grenades, TNT, and rifle fire, could not survive the sudden blast of flame that sucked oxygen from enclosed spaces and forced defenders to abandon their posts. They spoke candidly about how their men, trained to fight to the death, were often compelled to retreat when they saw the M2 aimed toward their tunnel entrance. And they acknowledged that had the Marines lacked flamethrowers, many of their defensive networks would have required horrific numbers of casualties to overcome. The flamethrower operators, however, rarely spoke publicly about their contributions. They often felt misunderstood. Some believed that the weapon's reputation overshadowed the purpose it served. Others felt that people who had never stepped onto a Pacific battlefield could never truly understand what choices had existed in those jungles and caves. A flamethrower operator from Okinawa once said that carrying the M2 was like walking with the weight of every life behind you. He explained that he did not fire because he wanted to, but because he had to. The men behind him depended on him to give them a chance to live. Another Marine explained that the M2 was not a weapon of aggression, it was a weapon of necessity. When your enemy buried himself in tunnels, covered firing slits with heavy logs, and refused to surrender no matter what happened outside, the battlefield changed. The fight became something no textbook had prepared them for. The flamethrower was not chosen because it was brutal. It was chosen because no other tool could break open the fortifications without sacrificing entire squads. Yet even with these truths known, the emotional contradictions remained. Flamethrower operators often described the intensity of the moments they faced, crawling forward under machine gun fire, feeling the tanks vibrate against their backs, knowing that every man behind them waited for the roar of the flame to break the deadlock. When the jet of fire ignited, the battlefield shifted in an instant. Darkness became light, silence inside bunkers became chaos, and for the Marines in the open, the moment became a chance to push forward, alive. As veterans aged, many spoke to historians and interviewers with quiet honesty about their role. They said that while the flamethrower terrified them, they respected what it accomplished. They said that it broke Japanese defenses that could not be broken by any other means. They said that it kept them from losing friends in hopeless charges. And they said that although the weapon was feared, its purpose had been to end battles faster with fewer American dead. Historians studying casualty reports from the Pacific later recognized a clear pattern. Whenever flamethrowers were used effectively, casualty numbers among American infantry dropped sharply. Positions that had cost dozens of lives on Guadalcanal now fell with minimal losses on Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The M2 changed the rhythm of the war. It turned previously impossible assaults into achievable objectives. It broke stalemates without requiring blood sacrifice. It forced defenders into the open, where standard infantry weapons could be used to finish the fight. Part 5 closes with a scene familiar to many Marines who survived the war. On a quiet morning after a hard fight, a flamethrower operator sits on the edge of a captured ridge. The sun rises across a battlefield that had once looked impossible to take. His tanks lie empty behind him. His hands are burned and shaking. His squad gathers around him. They laugh. They slap his shoulder. They tell him that he saved their lives. And in that moment, he He understands the truth he will carry for the rest of his life. The weapon he feared, the weapon everyone feared, had given them a future. It had turned certain death into survival, and though he would never call it anything but terrifying, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The M2 Flamethrower, more than any other weapon in the Pacific, saved thousands of American Marines from dying in battles that offered no mercy.